Have you ever wondered why Mary Magdalene, one of Jesus' closest followers, is remembered so differently across the world? In Western tradition, she's often reduced to a repentant sinner, a woman of shame turned saint. But what if that image, so familiar, so accepted, was not the whole truth? What if, hidden in the ancient highlands of Ethiopia, a different voice has been echoing for centuries? A voice that tells a richer, deeper, and far more powerful story. One where Mary is not a scandal to be forgiven, but a spiritual mother to be revered. In this video, we'll uncover the hidden story of Mary Magdalene, a narrative preserved not in the stained glass of European cathedrals, but in the chants of Ethiopian monks, in sacred books lost to the West, and in the living memory of one of Christianity's oldest traditions, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. The Ethiopian Bible is the most complete biblical canon in the world, with 81 books, many of which are unknown to most Christians today. And within this ancient library of wisdom, Mary Magdalene emerges not as a side character, but as a pillar of faith, courage, and divine insight. You'll hear about the Gospel of Mary, a banned text that reveals hidden teachings Jesus shared only with her. You'll learn how Ethiopia never accepted the Western mislabeling her as a prostitute. And you'll discover oral legends and hymns that honor her not only as the first witness of the resurrection, but as a mystic, a healer, and a guide for women seeking the divine. Stay until the end, because what we're about to uncover doesn't just restore the image of Mary Magdalene, it reclaims a vital part of Christian history that was never truly lost, just hidden. And if you find value in this journey, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Let's bring light to stories that were buried and voices that still deserve to be heard.
Imagine being remembered for something you never were. For centuries, Mary Magdalene, one of the most faithful followers of Jesus, has been wrapped in layers of misunderstanding. In the Western world, she's often portrayed as the penitent prostitute, a woman rescued from sin. But that identity wasn't part of the original Gospels. It was a mistake, a powerful one. The roots of this confusion trace back to the year 591 AD, when Pope Gregory I gave a sermon that would echo through history. In that message, he merged three distinct biblical women into one: Mary of Bethany, the unnamed sinner who anointed Jesus' feet, and Mary Magdalene. That combination painted a convenient picture: a single woman whose story moved from sin to salvation. But it wasn't accurate. The Gospels themselves never call Mary a prostitute. They never say she committed any scandalous acts. What they do say is far more profound. Mary Magdalene was a woman from Magdala, a town by the Sea of Galilee. She was healed by Jesus, freed from 7 demons, and from that moment she followed him closely. She stayed through his ministry, witnessed his crucifixion, and was present when others fled. And more than that, she was the first to see the risen Christ. Not Peter, not John, Mary. Think about that. In the most pivotal moment in Christian history, the resurrection, it was Mary who received the revelation. She wasn't just a bystander. She was the first apostle, the one who carried the news that would change the world. So how did this woman of such strength, faith, and spiritual insight become associated with shame? The answer lies in centuries of misinterpretation, patriarchal theology, and cultural bias. Over time, the narrative shifted from spiritual leadership to personal redemption. Her voice was softened, her role was reduced, and her legacy was blurred into something safe, something less threatening to male-dominated structures of power. But not everywhere. In the highlands of Ethiopia, her name was never buried, her truth was never rewritten. There, Mary Magdalene has always been remembered not for a false past, but for her true spiritual presence. As we move forward, we'll journey into Ethiopia's sacred tradition and rediscover the Mary Magdalene the West forgot, a mystic, a saint, and a spiritual mother whose story still holds power today. Because sometimes the voices most worth hearing are the ones we've been taught to ignore. While the West was busy rewriting Mary Magdalene's legacy, something extraordinary was being preserved, thousands of miles away, high in the mountains of East Africa. In Ethiopia, Christianity took root early. As far back as the 4th century, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church was established, not as a shadow of Roman tradition, but as its own ancient, thriving spiritual system. And at the heart of that system lies something the Western world has all but forgotten: the Ethiopian Bible. Unlike the standard Western canon of 66 books, the Ethiopian Bible includes 81 sacred texts. It is the most complete biblical canon in the world, containing books lost, rejected, or erased from mainstream Christianity. But these books weren't random additions. They were part of a spiritual tradition that valued mystical experience, divine wisdom, and the voices of those often silenced. So what's in these extra books? You'll find 1 Enoch, a visionary work filled with angels, apocalyptic dreams, and divine justice, a text so influential that it's quoted in the New Testament, but removed from most Western Bibles. There's Jubilees, a retelling of Genesis with deep spiritual undertones and celestial revelations. And the books of Maccabean, not to be confused with the Maccabees, offer insight into moral resistance and spiritual courage. These scriptures reflect a worldview where spiritual insight and mystical encounter are central, not mere obedience to law or institutional control. And within this rich spiritual landscape, figures like Mary Magdalene are seen not through suspicion, but through reverence. Although her name doesn't appear prominently in all these texts, the Ethiopian spiritual framework is deeply aligned with her story. A soul healed by divine power, a seeker of truth, a bearer of hidden wisdom, a disciple who defied fear and stayed near the sacred. And just as the Ethiopian Bible preserves forgotten texts, it also preserves forgotten voices, especially those of women. In Ethiopian tradition, holy women are remembered not just for their piety, but for their visions, their courage, and their direct encounters with the divine. It's no coincidence that Mary Magdalene finds such a profound place here. While the West turned to church councils and political power to define faith, Ethiopia turned inward, to the mountain monasteries, to the silence of prayer, to the whisper of spirit in the ancient language of Ge'ez. That's why the story of Mary Magdalene survived intact here, because Ethiopia never needed to sanitize or simplify the sacred. They preserved it in full. In the next part, we'll meet the Mary Magdalene of Ethiopia, not the woman misnamed in sermons, but the mystic, the healer, the spiritual mother whose legacy shaped an entire tradition.
Far from the cathedrals of Europe, high in the rock-hewn churches of Ethiopia, Mary Magdalene is remembered not as a sinner in need of forgiveness, but as a mystic who walked with God. In Ethiopian Christian tradition, Mary Magdalene holds a place of deep reverence. She is not seen through the lens of past sins or scandalized stories. Instead, she is honored for her spiritual clarity, her unshakable presence, and her intimate connection to the divine. She is known in the Ge'ez language as Mariam Magdala, a name spoken with affection and reverence during hymns, feast days, and monastic chants. Her story is passed down not only through scriptures, but through oral traditions, iconography, and liturgical poetry that portray her as more than just a follower. She is a spiritual mother, a woman who understood the mystery of the soul. In the Ethiopian Church, Mary Magdalene is counted among the myrrh bearers, the women who came to anoint Jesus' body after his crucifixion. But this role is not viewed as secondary or symbolic. It is sacred. These women are honored as priestly figures, guardians of sacred rites, caretakers of divine truth.
Ethiopian hymns praise Mary Magdalene for her healing touch, her power to cast out demons, and her ability to speak with the wisdom of prophets. In one ancient hymn still sung in remote monasteries, she is called "She who walks with fire in her mouth and truth in her eyes." This is not just poetic, it's theological. In Ethiopia, holiness is not confined to gender, and neither is spiritual authority. Mary is remembered as someone who lived in radical closeness to Jesus, who followed him when others fled, who stood at the foot of the cross and did not look away. And then, when the stone rolled away from the tomb, she was the first to see the risen Christ. That moment alone, recognized by all four Gospels, should have sealed her place as a pillar of the early church. But where others ignored it, Ethiopia remembered, because here, spiritual truth was never handed down by empire or politics. It was passed through encounter, through song, silence, vision, and presence. Mary's life aligns perfectly with Ethiopia's long tradition of mystics, those who left behind comfort to dwell in caves, fast for days, and seek divine revelation. In fact, some stories even describe her as living in the wilderness in her later years, much like the desert mothers of early Christian monasticism. And for Ethiopian women today, especially nuns in monastic life, Mary Magdalene remains a guiding light. During holy seasons, they sing praises to her endurance, her inner strength, and her unwavering devotion to God. So who is Mary Magdalene in Ethiopia? She's not a fallen woman. She's a healer, a teacher, a solitary mystic who stands as a spiritual anchor, especially for women. In our next part, we'll dive deeper into a forgotten text, the Gospel of Mary, and discover what Jesus may have revealed to her in secret, and why the world wasn't ready to hear it.
What if one of the earliest Christian texts centered not on Peter or Paul, but on Mary Magdalene? In 1896, a fragile papyrus manuscript was discovered in Egypt. It was later identified as the Gospel of Mary, a text that had been lost for centuries. And what it revealed would challenge everything many thought they knew about the early church. The Gospel of Mary paints a startlingly different portrait of Mary Magdalene, not as a forgiven sinner, not even just a loyal disciple, but as a spiritual leader, a woman to whom Jesus entrusted secret teachings, a woman who taught the other disciples after his resurrection, a woman who spoke with clarity, authority, and divine wisdom. In this gospel, after Jesus departs, the disciples are confused and fearful. It is Mary who rises, calms them, and begins to share the visions and teachings Christ revealed to her. She speaks of the soul's journey, of inner stillness, and of liberation through knowledge and spiritual awakening. But not everyone is ready to listen. Peter, representing the traditional male authority, questions her. Did he really speak these things to a woman and not to us? The tension is unmistakable. Mary responds with grace, but also firm conviction, saying, "I tell you what he told me." This moment is powerful, not only as a defense of her experience, but as a profound reminder that spiritual truth isn't confined by gender or hierarchy. It flows where it's welcomed, and in this case, it flowed to Mary. So, why did this gospel disappear? Most likely because it threatened the emerging structure of institutional Christianity. A text that elevates a woman as the recipient of divine revelation didn't fit the framework of a patriarchal church. And so, like many voices of women in early faith communities, it was buried, forgotten, silenced.
But here's the remarkable part. Even though the Gospel of Mary isn't officially part of the Ethiopian Bible, its spirit resonates deeply with Ethiopian tradition. Why? Because in Ethiopia, the value of a person is not determined by title or institutional power. It's measured by spiritual depth. Visionaries, mystics, and those who receive divine revelation, whether man or woman, are honored. Monastic communities often recount dreams, angelic visitations, and hidden wisdom. This worldview creates a space where Mary Magdalene's voice is not only valid, it's central. While the West debated her reputation, Ethiopia preserved a tradition that aligns closely with what the Gospel of Mary describes. A woman who receives revelation, a woman who speaks boldly, a woman whose wisdom challenges established power, and perhaps most importantly, a woman who doesn't wait for permission to lead. She leads because the Spirit spoke and she listened.
Scripture tells us that Mary Magdalene was the first to witness the risen Christ. But then her story fades. The spotlight shifts to Peter, James, Paul. Mary disappears into the margins of the written word. But what if her journey didn't end at the empty tomb? In Ethiopia and throughout parts of northeastern Africa, there are oral legends passed down for generations that speak of Mary Magdalene not only as a witness, but as a traveler, a teacher, and a mystic pilgrim. These stories say that after the resurrection, Mary didn't vanish. She moved, carrying the message of resurrection to lands already rich with ancient faith: Egypt, Nubia, even Ethiopia. Some legends describe her walking barefoot across desert sands, speaking with spiritual seekers under acacia trees, and praying in solitude in hidden caves. She wasn't preaching from temples, she was teaching by example, living a life of devotion, sacrifice, and divine intimacy. In one Ethiopian tale, Mary is said to have reached the mountainous regions near Lake Tana, where early Christian communities welcomed her not as a stranger, but as a saint. Her words, they say, carried fire, truth wrapped in stillness. She healed the sick, anointed the poor, and mentored women who would become early monastics. Could these stories be historically verified? Perhaps not by Western academic standards, but in Ethiopian tradition, truth isn't always written on paper. It's sung in chants, carved in stone, and whispered through memory. And in these memories, Mary Magdalene remains alive. Some accounts even suggest that Mary may have had African or Semitic roots, connecting her spiritually and ethnically to the very people among whom her story still thrives. Whether literal or symbolic, these claims carry a powerful truth. Mary Magdalene belongs to more than just one culture. Her legacy is global, sacred, and deeply human. This idea of oral transmission, where stories are passed down from elder to disciple, from mother to daughter, has been key to preserving her identity in Ethiopia. In a world where written history often erases women's voices, oral history gives them back. And if that weren't enough, some Ethiopian monks believe that there were once sacred writings attributed to Mary Magdalene herself, hidden or destroyed over time. While we may never find these texts, their possibility reminds us of how much spiritual wisdom has been lost, not by accident, but by design. So we ask again, what happened to Mary Magdalene? According to Ethiopian tradition, she didn't vanish. She became a solitary mystic, one who walked away from public fame and into the wilderness of the soul. There she lived not in silence, but in communion, with God, with creation, and with the legacy she would leave behind. In the next part, we'll return to the mountain monasteries of Ethiopia, where monks and nuns still sing her name, and see how Mary Magdalene's spirit lives on in the voices of devotion today.
In the silent dawn of Ethiopia's ancient monasteries, where the only sound is the wind against stone and the low hum of chanting voices, a name is still sung with reverence: Mary Magdalene. Here, nestled in the highlands, monks and nuns rise before sunrise to pray, fast, and sing hymns that have been passed down for centuries. Among these sacred verses are praises to Mary Magdalene, not as a woman of scandal, but as a spiritual anchor, a guiding flame of devotion. To Ethiopian Christians, Mary Magdalene embodies the soul's journey from darkness into divine light. Her story is not one of shame and redemption, it is one of courage, clarity, and transformation. She is revered as one of the myrrh-bearers, women who didn't flee, didn't doubt, and didn't hesitate. They came with oils and spices, not because they expected a miracle, but because love compelled them to honor the body of their teacher. That act alone is remembered in Ethiopia, not just as a ritual of mourning, but as a sacred priestly offering. In many Ethiopian convents, especially during Lent and Easter, nuns chant hymns in gayas, honoring Mary for her endurance, her wisdom, and her unwavering heart. They do not dwell on her past, because in this tradition, her holiness eclipses her history. What matters is not where she came from, but how deeply she followed. Mary Magdalene is also seen as a forerunner of the Desert Mothers, those early female ascetics who chose solitude and silence over societal security. These women sought not power or recognition, but God alone. And Mary, who followed Jesus into uncertainty, who stood at the tomb when others scattered, who embraced pain for the sake of truth, became their spiritual elder. In iconography, she is often shown holding a jar of myrrh or raising her hand in blessing, not in shame, but in strength. In some churches, her image is carved into ancient stone walls, her gaze soft yet unyielding. In others, her name is invoked during prayers for healing and protection, especially by women seeking guidance. To Ethiopian monastics, Mary Magdalene represents what is most sacred: a heart that listens, a soul that surrenders, and a life entirely devoted to the divine. And perhaps that's why her legacy endures here, not because of institutional power, but because of spiritual resonance. She speaks to the hidden parts of the human soul. She shows that intimacy with God is not reserved for the powerful, but for the persistent, the faithful, the silent ones who stay. In our final part, we'll return to the big question: why does Mary Magdalene's Ethiopian story matter today? What can it teach us, not just about history, but about how we honor the voices we've lost, and how we might hear them again?
So now we return to the question that opened our journey. Who was Mary Magdalene, really? In the dusty manuscripts of the Ethiopian Bible, in the chants of mountain monasteries, in the sacred memory of an unbroken Christian tradition, Mary Magdalene is not a footnote. She is not a scandal. She is not a shadowed figure in the background. She is a saint to be honored, a disciple to be heard, and a spiritual mother whose voice still calls to us across centuries and continents. Her story matters because it restores balance to the narrative of faith. It corrects a deep injustice, one that reduced a courageous, visionary woman into a caricature of sin. For far too long, the Western Church labeled her a prostitute, questioned her authority, and erased her voice. But Ethiopia never did. Here, she was remembered as a healer, a mystic,
a teacher, and above all, a beloved of God. And in reclaiming her story through the lens of Ethiopian Christianity, we don't just recover facts, we recover spiritual truth. That wisdom is not confined to the powerful, that devotion is not measured by gender, that those who walk in silence may carry the loudest truths. Mary Magdalene reminds us that the heart knows what institutions forget, that revelation comes to the receptive, that proximity to the divine isn't earned by position, but by presence. She stood by the cross. She stood by the tomb. She stood when others ran. And maybe, just maybe, that's why she was chosen to see the risen Christ first. Her life continues to echo in the voices of women and men who seek the sacred not through systems, but through surrender. She lives on in the songs of Ethiopian nuns, the prayers whispered in desert caves, and the icons carved into stone. So why does her Ethiopian story matter today? Because we're still rewriting who gets to speak. Because we're still rediscovering forgotten wisdom. Because we're still learning how to listen, not just with our ears, but with our hearts. Mary Magdalene, the apostle of the heart, invites us to remember what was hidden, and more importantly, to honor what we hear when we finally stop and listen. If this journey has stirred something in you, share this story. Comment, like, and subscribe for more forgotten voices, sacred texts, and spiritual truths waiting to be uncovered. Until next time, keep seeking, keep learning, and never be afraid to uncover what was hidden.